Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. We are going to take up discussion on today's newspaper, The Hindu, Delhi edition, dated 21st December 2020. We are going to pick up important articles for the civil service examination and discuss them as per the demand of the pattern. The articles that we are going to take up for discussion has been tabulated in front of you, and the time stamping for the same has been given in the description section. This article from page number 7 is titled Beyond Just Persuasion. See, persuasion is part of your GS syllabus. It has been very prominently mentioned under the syllabus of GS paper 4, Ethics, Integrity and Aptitude. Social influence and persuasion is a very important pillar of ethics paper, and questions every year does come directly or indirectly on this topic. This article has been written in the context of the logjam of the failure of dialogue between government and the protesting farmer group. The article acknowledges that the government has made effort to educate farmers. Government has used the tool of reasoning, which is a legitimate tool of persuasion, and this has been done by exchange of information. Government has tried its best through information dissemination through advertisement to convince the protesting farmer group of the merits of the government's reform agenda. Human beings make decisions based on information, and giving information to someone is a legitimate tool of persuasion. There is no problem in this technique, but as the title of the article is suggesting, government needs to go beyond just persuasion or beyond just this basic rudimentary simple form of persuasion. The author very brutally puts the mindset of government. The author is saying that the government considers farmers or the agrarians to be lesser intellectuals, and the complex policy matters, especially the economic policy, they require higher intellectual capabilities. So once the superior information that the government and the bureaucrats are carrying that is given to the farmers, farmers will know better. They will be enlightened, and by the virtue of that, they would support the government's reform agenda. But that does not seem to be happening. So clearly, government, whatever it is doing, is not enough. To understand why it is not enough, we will go to the basics of persuasion as it needs to be understood under the syllabus of GS paper 4. The author recognizes the fact that persuasion is not simply information dissemination. It is not information gathering and giving information linearly from government to people. Rather, persuasion is a psychological process. To give a formal definition of persuasion, you can say that persuasion is a method of changing a person's cognition, the information that he or she is holding, values, attitude, and ultimately behavior towards some object, issue, or person through some kind of communication. See, cognition is the information that a person is having. But behavior does not only come from information or knowledge. Behavior comes from mostly attitude, and attitude is formed through values. And emotion is an important component of values. Because there is involvement of emotion in one's behavior, that is why persuasion or changing one's behavior would essentially be a psychological process. So persuasion is not only rational decision making that will be based purely on information and logic, but it will involve emotional interaction as well. There are various forms and types of persuasion technique. Sometimes only pure logic can work. But we are talking about persuasion in a situation where a group feels vulnerable. And in circumstances that involves vulnerability, persuasion always require an element of trust. Because when you are vulnerable, it's an issue of survival. And you will not take decision just based on some information. It will take a lot to risk anything further. So if someone is asking you to do something, you need to have immense amount of trust in that person. So essentially, this is what is the learning from the article, and this is extremely important concerning the topic of persuasion of GS paper 4. In circumstances that involves vulnerability, Persuasion must have an element of trust. But the question is, do farmers trust the government? Obviously, there is trust deficit. That is why there is a log jam, or rather failure of dialogue. And obviously, there is vulnerability of farmers. In 2019, more than 10,000 cases of farmer suicide has been reported. Almost half of the farmers are small and marginal landholders. And you know that rural economy is under distress. So there is no doubt, there is no question on their vulnerability. It also has been reported that farmers' income is expected to rise by 9% this financial year. But still, the overall financial condition of farmers and the rural economy or the agrarian economy is precarious. Farmers also recognize the exploitative nature of the agricultural supply chain. But the big question is, how can you persuade farmers to adopt an alternative? How can you say that the alternative is better? Because when there is vulnerability, nobody is ready, nobody can afford to do more harm to oneself. It's a question of survival. So mere signaling or information transmission will not work, and government is mistaking information as panacea for trust deficit. See, as part of your syllabus, you have to do techniques of persuasion. You have to study opinions of various philosophers in this regard, and one of the important things that you do as part of this topic is the opinion, the teaching of Aristotle. Aristotle identified that the art of persuasion must consist of three parts: logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos refer to logic, information, rationality. Pathos refers to appealing to emotions. Logic always does not work. For instance, to give you an example, concerning climate change, if you are given data that the average atmospheric temperature will rise by so and so amount, so and so much of tons of iceberg are going to melt, sea level is going to rise by so much of centimeter, you might not be very receptive. But alternatively, if you are told that because of climate change, so many people are dying. The polar bears in the polar region, they are dying. The agricultural distress is increasing. The frequency and the intensity of natural disaster is increasing, and the burden is coming on the poor and the vulnerable. Then you might be more receptive to the information. Emotion becomes the carrier of logic. Without emotion, receptibility of logic is very less. So logos alone will not do. You need to have pathos along with logos. And the third very important component in the technique of persuasion is ethos, meaning appealing to ethics, morals, and character. Ethos has to do with who is the persuader. His or her identity will have great impact on how the audience takes the message. The credibility of the persuader will have great impact on the overall process of persuasion. For example, if MS Swaminathan walks up and talks to the farmers and says that the reform taken up by the government is in the interest of the farmer, that will have a greater impact. One can translate these three components given by Aristotle to the CAB model of attitude. In the CAB model, you see that there are three components of attitude: cognition, emotion, and behavior. Emotional component is also called as affective component, CAB. Logos will correspond to cognition. Cognition basically is information, knowledge. Pathos is the emotional component or affective component of attitude. And ethos will also come into this component because emotion will be more in case the ethics, moral, and character of the person is more appealing. For example, in case of role modeling, if your role model comes and gives a message, that will have a greater impact. Mr. Amitabh Bachchan giving message on use of mask and sanitizer for COVID-19 pandemic, that will have a greater impact than a random person with unknown voice giving the same message. Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam talking to the people, saying not to be concerned regarding the harm of neutrinos or neutrino-based project will have a greater impact than some government official or a bureaucrat giving the same message. And the behavioral component is your own past experience. In the past, if you were driving in fog and you have met some accident, then next time your attitude of driving in the fog will be very negative. You will tend not to do that. Now let's apply this to the farmer issue. So far we have seen attempts by government and various groups and media to influence the cognitive component of attitude. Very little has been done for the affective component or the emotional component of attitude. And behavioral component will come only when reform has taken place and farmer has seen the utility and the benefit of that. Going beyond persuasion, the title of the article is targeting this. The title of the article, Going Beyond Persuasion, means we have to go beyond the basic way of persuading farmers, which is giving them information. The article is presenting the case for targeting the effective component of attitude. So, where do we go from here? How do we do effective persuasion for the protesting groups? Be it farmers, be it for CEA, be it any protesting group, how can it be made effective? The author has suggested certain measures and they are very, very good. First of all, you have to begin interpersonal dialogue. That is being done to a certain extent. The most important suggestion of the author is to develop trust, because trust is a psychological attitude in itself. Trust reflects a positive expectation of behavior. Since behavior is influenced directly by trust, so trust in itself is an attitude. How will trust come? Trust comes from sincerity. Government has to show it is sincere for the reform. Negotiation should not be seen as an instrument to pacify the protesters, but rather to persuade. And when there is vulnerability, there has to be an element of trust to change the attitude. There are various ways that the author is suggesting this can be done. First of all, you have to show sincerity. You have to give public commitments. Politicians and bureaucrats, all the stakeholders in the government. When you do public commitments, you have set a target for yourself to be achieved. The stakeholders, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the scientists who have social credibility, they must walk up to the farmer group and have dialogue. Key government functionaries, the higher ups, they must approach the farmer groups, talk to them. That will not just be a symbolic gesture, that will be the beginning of both pathos and ethos, emotion and credibility. Then the author is suggesting a very effective tool in persuasion, shared vulnerability. Make sure you get acquainted by this term and you can use this in exam. Shared vulnerability. Meaning if the reform fails, it will not just be the loss of farmers, but also the loss of government. So regarding reforms, it is not just the farmers who are vulnerable, the government is also vulnerable. How can it be done? It can be done by target setting. It can be done by public commitments. It can be done by public declaration that doubling the farmer income is the top priority of government. And government must be judged electorally on that goal that government is setting for itself. When you make a public commitment like that, it also becomes your target. And failure of reform will also be your failure. Just like the government set the target of breaking into top 50 in the ease of doing business ranking, similarly, such kind of target can be set for agricultural reform and doubling the farmer's income as well. And then at every stage, monitoring and feedback and evaluation of success of the reform must be done. And that will target the behavioral component of attitude as well. When you start seeing the success of the reform, your attitude will be further changed. So we come back to the title of the article, Beyond Just Persuasion. Meaning beyond just giving information, beyond just targeting the cognitive component of attitude, you target the emotional and behavioral component as well. That is what the article means. And if you do that, it will work. Why? Because persuasion is powerful. Socrates has given the concept of moral intellectualism, meaning nobody knowingly does what is bad. If you give the correct information, and if you also make the situation conducive to make the person receptive to that information, meaning you also add an emotional component, you do proper persuasion, then people will do what is right thing to be done. Because Aristotle has said, man is a rational creature. Immanuel Kant has said, there is nothing above reason. So if you reason properly, and if you put emotion, that becomes a career for reasoning, and if you do in a credible manner, then persuasion will bring changes. And government has used it several times. Under the Give Up campaign, thousands of people in the middle class have given up their subsidy for LPG. Persuasion has been used very effectively for Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, for Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao Abhiyan. In conclusion, I'll tell you the most important crux of the article, building trust for the purpose of persuasion, is not just giving information and creating rational disciples. It is a process of providing one's sincerity, credibility, and moral character. Without these, it won't work. These elements completes the process of persuasion. With this, we have understood completely the process of persuasion and its component. Now you must tell me why persuasion is required in the process of governance. I'm asking you this because the reform can also be taken up in a stroke. Government can decide it has to be done and everyone will follow like rational disciples because government will give reasoning for that. It will be logical, it will be rational. Then why you have to bring people on board? If you just push the reform, you will see the changes coming up, and maybe over the period of time, some years down the line, everyone will realize that government was right. Question essentially is this: why do you need persuasion in the process of governance? Think about it and answer me in the language of ethics paper. This is the editorial article, The Right Call. Whose call? Supreme Court's call. Call on what? Call on staying the High Court order to set up a committee to inquire into the constitutional breakdown in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Constitutional breakdown or failure of constitutional machinery has been discussed in Article 356. Among the various discretionary power, Governor also has a discretionary power to send a report on failure of constitutional machinery in states. Upon receiving such report or otherwise, President proclaim emergency under Article 356 and takes upon himself the powers of the government of state. Now, there is no provision in the Constitution where judiciary can initiate the process of finding out if there is breakdown of constitutional machinery in the state. Proclamation of emergency is purely in the domain of executive. And to maintain the basic structure of the Constitution, to maintain separation of power among different organs of the state, it is important that the powers exclusively given to executive is not impinged by judiciary. That is why Supreme Court, as the editorial article is suggesting, has made the right call, stayed the judgment of the High Court, and made observation that it was not up to the High Court to inquire and recommend President's rule in a state. Supreme Court also has said that Article 356 that deals with failure of constitutional machinery in a state is a power given exclusively to executive. Just to give you a related but very important piece of information concerning this issue, Supreme Court discussed in S.R. Bommai case as to how the executive will be exercising power vested on it by Article 356. First of all, whenever the imposition of President rule in a state will be proclaimed by the President, proclamation by the Union Council of Ministers must come first. The proclamation by the Union Council of Ministers will ascertain whether objective conditions exist which render it impossible to carry out governance in the state. Then under Article 356 Clause 3, the proclamation has to be approved by Parliament within 2 months. And only after that, the case will be open for judicial review. Judicial review comes last in the entire process of proclamation of President rule in the state. The High Court judgment, however, seems to have reversed the scheme of things and put the cart before the horse. Judicial review has become the first step. The High Court has given the order to form a committee to inquire into the constitutional breakdown in the state. This is a kind of judicial review. That is why the Chief Justice of India has found the judgment to be disturbing before putting stay on it. Very clearly, this is a case of judicial overreach, and you can use this case as an example of judicial overreach in exam. Judicial activism and judicial overreach was discussed in the DNS of 17th December 2020 by our illustrious Vaibhav sir. So we'll not be getting into it, but definitely, very confidently, you can use this as an example of judicial overreach. This is the lead article from page number 6, laying the foundation for faster growth. The lockdown imposed due to COVID-19 has led to both demand and supply side disruption in the Indian economy. You would be aware that GDP has contracted by around 24% in the first quarter of this financial year. India has seen contraction in the GDP for the first time in last 41 years, since 1979. In this regard, the article discusses as to what should be done in order to revive the Indian economy. The article highlights that the Indian economy should grow at around 8% in 2021-2022 to compensate for the decline in the present financial year. Even with a strong growth of around 8%, we will only be back to where the economy was at the end of 2019-20. Hence, in order to enable the Indian economy to grow at 8% in the next financial year, there are certain things that the author is suggesting. Number one, enhance the government expenditure. According to the expenditure method, GDP is calculated as C plus G plus I plus X minus M, where C denotes private final consumption expenditure. G denotes government final consumption expenditure. I denotes investment, X denotes export, and M denotes import. Private final consumption expenditure and investment are traditionally the driver of Indian economy. However, since the present economic crisis is quite unprecedented, there is a need to enhance government's expenditure, particularly in creation of new capital assets such as road, railways, ports. The increase in government's expenditure will in turn enhance the consumption and investment expenditure, and then the Indian economy can come in the virtuous cycle that will increase our GDP. The next suggestion by the author is to keep check on inflation. The CPI rate of inflation has increased to 6.93% in November this year. It is much above the targeted range of 6%. The higher rate of inflation prevailing in the Indian economy may prolong the economic revival. Hence, necessary measures are required by RBI to keep inflation under check. The third suggestion by the author is to revive the investment climate in our country. Investment rate in the Indian economy has declined from around 39% in 2011-12 to 32% in 2018-19. Hence, measures should be taken to revive the investment rate by reducing the NPAs of the bank. We see there is scope of upward movement of investment, and to tap on this scope, certain measures like reducing the NPA rates of banks and improving their balance sheet is required. National Infrastructure Pipeline is a good initiative in this regard, and momentum must be given for implementation of this initiative. See, government has come up with a vision of $5 trillion economy by end of 2025. To realize this vision, the Indian economy needs to grow consistently at 9% over the next 6 years. Hence, the government must take the lead in enhancing its investment in order to promote economic revival. This article is from page number 7, Losing the Plot on Women's Safety. By the phrase losing the plot, the author is trying to say that we are not going in the right direction in constructing legal jurisprudence for women's safety. Authors are highlighting that when faced with the question of women's safety, inevitably, always, we try to enact tough laws rather than making our legal system more effective. And this observation has been discussed in the context of a bill introduced by the state of Maharashtra called Shakti Criminal Law Maharashtra Amendment Bill 2020. The provision of the law are strict, and there are certain other things that we will discuss based on which the authors are saying that we are losing the plot on women's safety. The authors have highlighted 4 elements of any effective criminal justice system. First and foremost, there must be fair and just laws. Fair and just. Punishment must be proportional to the crime. And rest of the 3 elements make up the system that is used to implement the law. There must be adequate infrastructure of forensic laboratory, infrastructure to collect evidences, infrastructure to carry out trial that will include the manpower in the police force, in the investigative team, in the judiciary. And there has to be a dynamic judiciary that will include empathetic interpretation of the law and good sex ratio, especially in higher judiciary. If there is no system in place, then no matter how good and fair and just laws you have, it won't work. But the problem begins here. The laws that we are enacting are too strict and that will not work in itself, regardless of no system being in place. See, authors have highlighted that the bill has introduced death penalty for rape, acid attacks, and rape of a minor. The bill reads, in cases where the characteristic of offense is heinous and where adequate conclusive evidence is there that the circumstances warrant exemplary punishment, the offense shall be punishable with death. Death penalty has been there in India's legal jurisprudence for long, but there is no evidence to suggest that it's potent in creating a deterrence and preventing crimes. The authors are rightly suggesting that death penalty is not an absolute answer to the issue of rape. It is actually certainty that punishment will come. That is the deterrence. And certainty of punishment will happen only if there is a system in place. Even if we set that aside for a while, death penalty in itself will derail the process of justice delivery to the victim. The authors have highlighted a very important point that death penalty will only ensure that accused may not stop at just raping. The offender may end up murdering the victim because many a time the victim is the only witness, and murdering the victim will mean getting rid of the only witness. The logic here is even if you murder, you cannot be given a punishment higher than death penalty, which you are already getting by raping. So the authors are of the opinion that the death penalty will actually become driver of crime. Punishment in both cases would be the same. The article also has highlighted that several studies have shown that accused in sexual assault crimes are relatives or acquaintances. And if the punishment for the crime is death, then it is not only the family of the victim, but the victim herself may choose not to report because of extremely harsh punishment of death. The article highlights that several researchers also indicate that judges are also less likely to convict a person when the punishment is death. At the data point on page number 7, you will get to see that increasingly from 2007 towards 2020, more and more countries have voted at UN in favor of putting a moratorium on death penalties. In case of India, even though the death penalty has been given as punishment in several cases, execution is very, very rarely done. So contrary to the state's understanding, death penalty is not the solution to the problem of violence against women. In other cases where we have gone off the plot, or where this particular bill of a state of Maharashtra, although well-intentioned, has gone wrong. The bill stipulates that investigation should be completed within 15 days, the trial in 30 days, and appeal in 45 days. Similar timeline, similar mechanism exist for other legislation like Juvenile Justice Act and POSCO Act, but timelines are rarely met. Why? Because we do not have a system in place. Do you know we have only around 20 judges per million population? There is a total vacancy of around 23% in judiciary in India. Law Commission in its 120th report recommended that the strength of judges per million population must be around 50. And also, do you know in police, deficit is around 22% of total sanction strength. We have around 138 police personnel per lakh of population against the recommended number by UN of 222 per lakh of population. These are vacancies, let alone the expertise, the infrastructure, the laboratory, the technology, all those deficits. A third very important aspect that the article has highlighted where we have gone off the plot in creating legal jurisprudence concerning women's safety in India. Women's safety legislations have patriarchal bias. The authors highlight that the bill proposes punishment in case of false complaints. If false information regarding sexual or other offenses are provided by women with the intention to humiliate or extort money or defame the person, then that will call for punishment, which on the face of it is okay. The authors say that only other law which has similar provision is Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace 2013. Supreme Court has made observation recently that Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act has been misused. But even that legislation does not have punishment for misuse for false complaint. Embedded punishment in the law for false complaint are there only in laws concerning women's safety. That from societal and legal jurisprudence perspective is problematic. The authors have also correctly highlighted that offenses against women occur behind closed doors, unlike other offenses or maybe offenses against scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in general. So many a times in such cases, because of lack of witnesses, there is unfair acquittal of the perpetrator. And then victims in turn may be accused of having filed a false complaint. So authors are rightly pointing out that a provision for punishing false complaint would result in counter cases being filed against victim, and that will discourage the victims of sexual assault and acid attacks from filing complaints. There have been several instances in which the high courts have encouraged the victims to marry or to forego cases against the abuser. The latest one comes from the High Court of Madhya Pradesh, where the abuser got bail on the condition that he will go and tie Rakhi to the victim and give sweets to the children of the victim, which was absurd. So the legal jurisprudence concerning women's safety and laws which are made for women's safety are deeply entrenched with patriarchal biases. On these grounds, the bill has been opposed by several women rights organizations and lawyers from Maharashtra, and rightly so, the state government has referred it to a joint select committee. It would not only be in the interest of women, but in the interest of justice delivery system in India that a larger consultative process is developed and the bill is purged, removing these deformities and lacunas. This article from page number 10 highlights the unfinished chapters in the story of India-US relationship. This is an important area for your preparation in the International Relations section of GS Paper 2. The issues which are lingering and needs to be closed in the Indo-US relationship has been already discussed several times recently in the DNS. For instance, in the DNS of 10th of November 2020, 19th November and also on 30th of November. So we are not doing it again, but you must run horses in your mind and collect the points concerning this specific issue. And with that, we have come to the end of the session. Answer to yesterday's question of the day is option B. Today's question of the day is in front of you. For the sense of completeness of today's current affair, I would recommend you please go and attempt the DNS quiz on the ELEARN platform. Goodbye, take care.